The late afternoon sun filtered through Elena Martinez's sheer curtains, casting long shadows across her living room as she settled into her favorite armchair with a cup of chamomile tea. At 58, she had developed certain comforting routines since her husband passed 3 years ago, and checking social media had become one of them, a way to stay connected to her family's lives, especially when they seemed too busy to call. She opened Instagram on her phone, expecting to see the usual posts from her neighborhood friends and former teaching colleagues. Instead, the first image that appeared made her hands freeze around her teacup. It was a wedding photo. Marcus, her 32-year-old son, looking handsome in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his arm wrapped around Brittany in an elaborate white gown that must have cost more than Elena's monthly pension. "That's beautiful," she whispered to herself, smiling despite the familiar ache of not being invited. But as she scrolled through the photos, her smile began to fade. There was 6-year-old Sophie, her granddaughter, adorable in a pink flower girl dress, scattering rose petals down an aisle lined with elegant white chairs. Elena's heart swelled with pride, even as it broke a little more. She had helped pick out Sophie's school clothes just last month, back when she was still welcome in their lives. The next photo showed the wedding party. Marcus's college friends, Brittany's sorority sisters, all young and glowing. Then came the family photos. Elena leaned forward, squinting at the screen. There was Brittany's mother, Linda, in a sophisticated navy dress, holding Sophie's hand. Brittany's father, Robert, stood proudly beside Marcus, looking like the father of the groom Elena should have been standing next to. But it was the next photo that made Elena's teacup slip from her trembling fingers, clattering against the saucer. There, seated in the front row in a place of honor, was an elderly man she recognized from previous family gatherings, Brittany's grandfather, Thomas Chen. He must have been 85 if he was a day, beaming in his wheelchair as family members surrounded him with love and attention. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she read the caption beneath the photo. "So grateful to have 4 generations celebrating together. Grandpa Thomas made it despite his health concerns. Wouldn't miss seeing his granddaughter marry the love of her life. Perfect intimate family wedding with just our closest loved ones." Family. First, small wedding. Blessed. The words blurred as tears filled Elena's eyes. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had called her with barely concealed impatience in his voice. "Mom, about the wedding. You don't need to come. It's just going to be really small, just immediate family. Brittany's really stressed about keeping the numbers down." She had accepted it then, swallowing her disappointment, telling herself she understood. Young couples needed their space. Weddings were expensive. She didn't want to be a burden. But this wasn't a small wedding. This wasn't just immediate family. This was a deliberate choice to exclude her while including everyone else who mattered to them. Elena stared at the photo of Brittany's grandfather, remembering how she had raised Marcus alone after his father died when he was 12, how she had worked double shifts as a substitute teacher to pay for his college, how she had been there for every milestone, every heartbreak, every triumph. Now she wasn't even considered close family anymore. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Elena set down her phone and stared at the wall of family photos across from her chair, wondering when exactly she had become disposable to the people she loved most. Elena had always believed that love was measured in small, daily acts of devotion. In the 3 years since her husband Robert passed away from a sudden heart attack, she had poured every ounce of that devotion into being the perfect mother and grandmother. It had become her identity, her purpose, her reason for getting up each morning. Every Friday evening, like clockwork, she would prepare her small apartment for Sophie's weekend visits. She kept a special drawer filled with coloring books, puzzles, and art supplies. The refrigerator was always stocked with Sophie's favorites: strawberry yogurt, string cheese, and those expensive organic apple slices that Brittany insisted on. Elena didn't mind the extra cost. Seeing Sophie's face light up when she opened the fridge made every penny worth it. Grandma Elena makes the best pancakes in the whole world, Sophie would announce every Saturday morning, standing on her little step stool beside the stove, carefully helping flip each golden circle. Those weekend mornings felt like the most important moments of Elena's life. Just her and Sophie, creating memories in the warm kitchen while cartoons played softly in the background. Sunday dinners had become legendary in their small family circle. Elena would spend most of Saturday preparing her famous pot roast with roasted vegetables, homemade dinner rolls that took hours to rise properly, and Marcus's childhood favorite, tres leches cake. Her dining table, though modest, could barely contain the feast she prepared each week. Marcus would arrive with Brittany around 2 o'clock, and they would spend the afternoon eating, talking, and watching Sophie play with the toys Elena kept specifically for these visits. "Mom, you really don't have to go to all this trouble every week," Marcus would say. But he always came back for seconds, and Elena could see the contentment in his eyes as he relaxed in her living room, feet up on the coffee table, just like when he was a teenager. The financial help had started small. When Marcus and Brittany were looking at houses 2 years ago, Elena had quietly liquidated one of her retirement accounts to help with their down payment. $25,000, nearly half of what Robert had left her. But seeing them get the keys to their dream home in the suburbs had made the sacrifice feel meaningful. "We'll pay you back as soon as we get settled," Marcus had promised. Though they both knew that probably wouldn't happen on his marketing salary and Brittany's inconsistent influencer income. Elena had become their unofficial emergency contact for everything. When Sophie got sick at school, they called Elena first. When their water heater broke on a Sunday morning, Marcus was on the phone before 8 a.m. asking if his mother could lend them $1,500 to replace it. When Brittany needed someone to watch Sophie during her weekend yoga retreats, Elena cleared her schedule without question. Her phone was always within reach, volume turned up even at night in case they needed her. She had canceled book club meetings, skipped her own doctor's appointments, and turned down invitations from old teaching colleagues because family came first. Always family first. The apartment walls were covered with photos documenting her devotion. Marcus's graduation from college, Sophie's first birthday party, family Christmas mornings, vacation pictures from the trip to Disney World she had paid for last year. In every photo, Elena stood slightly to the side, the one behind the camera more often than in front of it, but always present, always reliable, always there. She had rebuilt her entire life around being indispensable to them. After Robert died, she thought she had found her new purpose, being the family cornerstone, the one person they could always count on. She measured her worth in their smiles, their gratitude, their need for her. It never occurred to her that love could be so one-sided, or that being needed wasn't the same as being valued. The conversation happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 2 months before the wedding that Elena didn't yet know she wouldn't be invited to. She had arrived at Marcus and Brittany's house with a carefully organized binder full of wedding planning ideas she'd been collecting for weeks: venue options, catering menus, flower arrangements, and color schemes she thought would complement Brittany's complexion beautifully. "I know you're both busy with work," Elena said, settling onto their pristine white couch and opening her binder with excitement. "So I thought I could help coordinate some of the details. I found this wonderful florist who does the most gorgeous centerpieces, and there's a bakery downtown that makes wedding cakes that taste just like heaven." Brittany looked up from her laptop, where she'd been editing photos for her lifestyle blog, her perfectly contoured eyebrows raising slightly. She was wearing one of those oversized sweaters that somehow managed to look both casual and expensive, her blonde hair pulled back in an effortlessly messy bun that probably took 20 minutes to achieve. "Oh, Elena," Brittany said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was trying to sound sweet while delivering disappointment. "That's so thoughtful of you, but we've already hired a wedding planner. Jasmine Westbrook. She's amazing. She did Courtney's wedding last year, and it was absolutely stunning. Very high-end, very sophisticated." Elena felt a small flutter of confusion. "A wedding planner? But with the budget and everything, I could help save you some money. I've been to so many weddings over the years, and I know all the little tricks to make things look expensive without. We want everything to be, cohesive." Brittany interrupted gently, closing her laptop and giving Elena her full attention. Cohesive and modern. Jasmine has this incredible vision for the whole event. She's thinking clean lines, minimalist elegance, very contemporary. She's even flying in these specialty linens from Los Angeles. Elena glanced around their living room, suddenly seeing it through different eyes. Her binder full of printed Pinterest ideas and handwritten notes seemed hopelessly outdated compared to the sleek decor surrounding her. Everything in their home was white, gray, or glass. Nothing like her own apartment with its warm earth tones and comfortable lived-in furniture. Modern, Elena repeated slowly, trying to understand what that meant in wedding terms. Well, I'm sure I could adapt. I mean, I've been keeping up with trends and… The thing is, Brittany continued, her smile becoming more strained, Jasmine really needs complete creative control. That's how she works. She can't have too many voices in the mix, you know? It would compromise her artistic vision. Marcus, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, finally looked up from his phone. Mom, you understand, right? We just want everything to be perfect. Elena studied her son's face, searching for the boy who used to ask her opinion on everything from what shirt to wear to which college to attend. But Marcus wouldn't quite meet her eyes, and something cold settled in her stomach. Of course, she heard herself saying, closing the binder with hands that felt suddenly clumsy. I just thought, well, I wanted to help. You can help in other ways, Brittany said brightly. Maybe you could handle addressing the invitations? That would be such a huge help. Elena nodded, gathering her things while trying to shake the feeling that she'd just been politely but firmly put in her place. As she drove home, she kept replaying Brittany's emphasis on the word modern and couldn't escape the uncomfortable realization that in her future daughter-in-law's carefully curated world, Elena herself might be considered outdated too. The changes came gradually, like a slow leak that Elena didn't notice until the foundation had already shifted beneath her feet. What used to be natural and effortless, her relationship with Marcus and Brittany, now required careful navigation through an invisible minefield of new rules she didn't understand. The first casualty was their Sunday dinners. For 2 years, Elena had set her table for 4 every weekend, planning elaborate menus around Marcus's favorites and Sophie's dietary preferences. But suddenly, the family had conflicts. We promised Sophie we'd take her to that new trampoline park, Brittany would text on Saturday nights. Rain check on dinner? The rain checks accumulated like unpaid debts, and Elena found herself eating pot roast alone while staring at 3 empty chairs. When they did come, the atmosphere felt different. Brittany would compliment the food with slightly surprised enthusiasm, as if she hadn't expected it to be good. This is actually really tasty, Elena. Very home-style. The pause before home-style made it sound like a polite way of saying old-fashioned. She'd pull out her phone during dinner to capture Sophie eating. But somehow Elena never appeared in those Instagram stories showcasing their family time. The weekend visits with Sophie became increasingly rare. Sophie's getting so busy with activities now, Brittany explained during one of their brief phone conversations. Dance class on Saturdays, and then she's so tired on Sundays. You know how important routine is for children her age. Elena did know. She'd taught elementary school for 30 years. But pointing that out seemed somehow wrong now, like she was being pushy or presumptuous about her own expertise. When she did see Sophie, the little girl seemed different too, more polite and distant. Mommy says I need to use my inside voice at Grandma's house because some people need quiet, Sophie announced during what turned out to be their last overnight visit. The phone calls became exercises in walking on eggshells. When Elena called to check in, her questions were met with brief, distracted answers. How was Sophie's dance recital? She'd ask, having seen photos on Facebook after the fact. Oh, it was fine. Just a little thing at the studio, nothing major. But the photos showed elaborate costumes and proud family members. Brittany's parents front and center, holding bouquets bigger than Sophie herself. Elena started censoring herself in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. She stopped offering parenting advice, even when Sophie showed up with a cough that clearly needed attention. She stopped suggesting activities or outings, having been told too many times that they already had plans. She even stopped bringing up memories of Marcus's childhood, after Brittany made a comment about how dwelling on the past isn't always healthy for moving forward. The most painful erosion was in her role as grandmother. Brittany's parents, Linda and Robert Chen, seemed to be taking over traditions that Elena had thought were hers. They took Sophie to her first baseball game, bought her first bicycle, and were there for the school events that Elena learned about only through social media posts afterward. "We didn't want to bother you," Marcus would say when Elena asked why she hadn't been invited to Sophie's school play or art show. "You always say how tired you get these days." Elena couldn't remember ever saying that, but she began to doubt her own memory. The woman who had once been the family's go-to person for everything now felt like she was constantly apologizing for existing in their orbit. She found herself saying, "I'm sorry," for calling at dinner time, for asking questions, for caring too much, for taking up space in conversations that seemed to flow better without her input. Elena didn't recognize this careful, diminished version of herself, but she didn't know how to get back to who she used to be in their eyes. The spring evening air carried the sound of children's laughter and parents' chatter as Elena walked across the elementary school parking lot toward Jefferson Elementary's multi-purpose room. Sophie's first grade class was performing their annual spring play, The Garden of Friendship, and Elena had been looking forward to this moment for weeks. She'd even bought a new blouse, soft lavender that Sophie had admired during their last visit, and charged her phone camera to capture every precious second. Elena arrived 15 minutes early, clutching a small bouquet of daisies she'd picked from her garden that morning. She scanned the rapidly filling auditorium, expecting to see Marcus waving her over to saved seats like they'd done for every school event since Sophie started kindergarten. Instead, she spotted them in the third row, the perfect viewing spot. But something was wrong with the picture. Marcus sat next to Brittany, who was adjusting her ring light for the perfect Instagram photos. But on Brittany's other side sat Linda and Robert Chen, Brittany's parents, looking like proud grandparents with a professional camera and a gift bag that was certainly more expensive than Elena's modest daisies. They had saved seats all right, a neat row of 5 chairs with jackets and purses marking the territory. Elena counted twice, her heart sinking as she realized there were only 5 seats for what should have been 6 family members. She approached hesitantly, hoping there had been some mistake. "Marcus," she called softly, not wanting to disturb other families. He looked up with a startled expression, as if he'd forgotten she was coming. "Oh, hey, Mom, you made it." "Of course I made it," Elena said, confused by his surprise. "Where should I sit?" An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Brittany looked up from her phone with an expression that seemed almost annoyed by the interruption. "Oh, Elena, I'm so sorry. We thought you were going to sit with the other families. We saved these seats earlier, but—" She gestured vaguely at the full row. Elena felt heat creep up her neck. "Other families? But I am family." I know," Brittany said quickly, her voice taking on that overly sweet tone Elena had learned to dread. "It's just that Mom and Dad flew in specifically for this, and they have the good camera equipment and—" She trailed off, as if that explanation made perfect sense. Linda Chen leaned forward with a sympathetic smile that somehow made everything worse. "Elena, dear, why don't you find a nice seat wherever you're comfortable? We'll make sure to get good photos and share them with you." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. Elena stood there for a moment, clutching her simple bouquet while other parents filed around her, claiming their seats with the easy confidence of people who belonged. She watched a grandmother 2 rows back wave enthusiastically to her family, who had clearly saved her a seat right in the middle of their group. "I'll just find somewhere else," Elena managed, backing away before anyone could see the tears threatening to spill. She ended up in the back row, partially hidden behind a support pillar. When other grandparents asked during intermission where her family was sitting, Elena had to pretend she'd chosen the back for a better view, that the pillar blocking half the stage was actually preferable. The worst part came after the performance. Elena watched from her distant vantage point as Sophie ran off stage straight into the arms of Grandma and Grandpa Chen, who scooped her up with congratulations and what looked like an expensive gift. Marcus and Brittany flanked them, creating a perfect family photo opportunity that Elena captured accidentally in the background of her own distant, blurry shots. Sophie eventually noticed Elena waiting by the exit and ran over with obligatory politeness. "Hi, Grandma Elena. Did you see me as the sunflower?" "You were beautiful, sweetheart," Elena said, offering the daisies with a trembling smile. "Thanks," Sophie said, but she was already looking back toward the other grandparents, who were clearly the stars of her evening. Elena drove home in silence. The image of that perfect family circle burned into her memory, a circle that had somehow been drawn around everyone except her. Elena chose the restaurant carefully for what she hoped would be a reconciling family dinner. Romano's, the cozy Italian place where they'd celebrated Marcus's promotion last year, and Sophie's 6th birthday just 3 months ago. She'd made the reservation for 4, thinking perhaps a neutral, familiar setting might help them return to the warmth they'd once shared as a family. She arrived first, as always, and requested their usual corner booth. The hostess, Maria, recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Martinez, so nice to see you again. The family coming tonight?" "Yes," Elena said, smoothing her navy dress, another new purchase, chosen to look more modern in case that mattered. "My son and his family." When Marcus, Brittany, and Sophie arrived 20 minutes later, Elena noticed immediately that something felt orchestrated about their entrance. Brittany wore a flowing maxi dress that screamed expensive simplicity, and Marcus had on a button-down shirt Elena had never seen before. Even Sophie looked unusually formal in a dress that definitely hadn't come from Target. "Sorry we're late," Marcus said, sliding into the booth across from his mother. "Traffic was crazy." But Elena had seen them in the parking lot through the window, sitting in their car for 10 minutes, clearly having some kind of serious conversation. Brittany had been gesturing emphatically, while Marcus nodded with the resigned expression of a man who'd already lost an argument. They ordered appetizers and made small talk about Sophie's upcoming summer schedule, but Elena could feel the tension building like pressure in a storm system. Marcus kept glancing at Brittany, who was giving him meaningful looks while cutting Sophie's chicken into unnecessarily small pieces. Finally, as the waiter cleared their dinner plates, Marcus cleared his throat in a way that reminded Elena of when he was 12 years old, preparing to confess he'd broken something valuable. "Mom, we need to talk about the wedding." Elena's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "What about it? I thought everything was finalized with your planner." Brittany took over then, her hands folded neatly on the table like she was delivering a business presentation. "Elena, we've been talking, and we've decided to keep the wedding really, really small, like intimate small. We're talking immediate family only." "I am immediate family," Elena said quietly, setting down her fork. "Well, yes, of course you are," Brittany continued with that practiced smile. "But we're having to make some really difficult decisions about the guest list. The venue has capacity restrictions, and with COVID protocols still being a concern, we just can't have everyone we'd like to have there." Elena looked at her son, waiting for him to speak, to explain, to advocate for her. But Marcus was studying his hands like they contained the secrets of the universe. "How many people are you having?" Elena asked. "About 40, Brittany said quickly. "Which sounds like a lot, but when you factor in the wedding party and both sets of parents and Marcus's college friends and my work colleagues who are basically family, 40 people," Elena repeated. "And there's no room for the woman who raised him?" The silence stretched until Sophie broke it by asking if she could have dessert. Brittany immediately began fussing with Sophie's napkin, grateful for the distraction. "Mom," Marcus finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you understand, right? It's about creating the right atmosphere for our new beginning. Brittany's really stressed about this whole thing, and we just need—" He never finished the sentence, but Elena heard what he wasn't saying. They needed her to disappear gracefully, to make this easier for everyone else by simply not existing for their most important day. Elena looked around the table at these 3 people she loved more than her own life. Sophie was coloring on her kids' menu, oblivious to the conversation that was reshaping her family. Brittany was checking her phone. Marcus still wouldn't meet her eyes. Without saying a word, Elena reached for her purse, placed two $20 bills on the table to cover her portion of the meal, and stood up. "Elena, where are you going?" Brittany asked, finally looking genuinely surprised. "Home," Elena said simply. "Enjoy your dessert." The wedding day arrived on a perfect Saturday morning in late May, the kind of sunshine-filled spring day that Elena would have once declared blessed weather for a wedding. Instead, she woke to golden light streaming through her bedroom curtains and felt the weight of exclusion settle over her like a heavy blanket she couldn't throw off. Elena had planned to spend the day productively, maybe clean out her closets or finally organize the boxes of teaching materials she'd been avoiding since retirement. Instead, she found herself sitting in her nightgown at 10 in the morning, surrounded by photo albums spread across her coffee table like evidence of a life that no longer seemed to matter. Here was 3-year-old Marcus on his first day of preschool, clinging to her leg with tears streaming down his face until she promised to pick him up right after snack time. Here he was at 8, gap-toothed and proud in his Little League uniform, holding the trophy she'd cheered herself hoarse helping him win. His high school graduation, where he'd thanked her in his valedictorian speech for being both mom and dad when I needed her most. The college photos were harder to look at now. Marcus in his cap and gown, Elena beaming beside him outside the administration building. She remembered how he'd insisted she stand right next to him for every photo that day, how he'd introduced her to his professors as the woman who made all this possible. She'd worked double shifts for 4 years to pay his tuition, turning down dates and social opportunities to make sure he never had to worry about student loans. The more recent photos told a different story. Elena noticed how she'd gradually moved from the center of family pictures to the edges, how her smile had become more tentative, less certain of her welcome. In Sophie's birthday photos from just 6 months ago, Elena stood slightly apart from the main group, holding a gift that had been opened and quickly set aside in favor of more expensive presents from Brittany's family. Her phone buzzed occasionally throughout the morning. Text messages from her friend Grace asking how she was holding up, a call from her brother David in Phoenix expressing outrage on her behalf. But Elena let them all go to voicemail. She wasn't ready to put on a brave voice and pretend she was handling this with dignity. By noon, the silence in her apartment had become oppressive. She could picture the ceremony happening 60 miles away. Marcus waiting at the altar in his tuxedo, Brittany walking down the aisle in her expensive dress, Sophie scattering rose petals with careful precision. She imagined the photographer capturing every moment, the videographer preserving memories that would be treasured for generations, none of which would include her. Elena made herself a sandwich she couldn't taste and turned on the television, but every channel seemed to be showing romantic comedies or wedding-themed programs. She finally settled on a nature documentary about wolves, finding some bitter comfort in watching a pack dynamic where loyalty and family bonds actually meant something. As the afternoon wore on, Elena found herself staring at the framed photo on her mantelpiece, her wedding picture with Robert from 35 years ago. They'd had a small ceremony too, just 25 people in the community center, but it had included everyone who mattered to them. Robert's elderly grandmother had been given a place of honor in the front row despite needing a wheelchair. Elena's widowed father had walked her down the aisle with tears of pride in his eyes. "What did I do wrong, Robert?" she whispered to the photograph. "I loved him the way you taught me to love him. I sacrificed everything for that boy, just like we planned. So why does he treat me like I'm disposable?" The silence that answered her was more devastating than any response could have been. Elena pulled an Afghan over herself and closed her eyes, trying to remember the last time she'd felt truly wanted by anyone, the last time her presence had brought joy instead of obligation to someone she loved. The wedding was probably over by now, and she wasn't sure which hurt more, being excluded from the ceremony or knowing that her absence likely hadn't been noticed at all. Tuesday morning brought Elena's weekly coffee date with Grace Chen at Rosie's Cafe, a ritual they'd maintained since Elena's retirement 2 years ago. Grace had been calling and texting all weekend, but Elena had finally agreed to meet, needing to get out of her apartment before she completely disappeared into her own grief. Grace was already waiting in their usual corner booth when Elena arrived, her nursing scrubs replaced by casual jeans and a concerned expression that Elena recognized immediately. Grace had been her closest friend for over 15 years, the kind of friend who could read Elena's moods from across a school hallway and always knew when to listen versus when to give advice. "You look terrible," Grace said without preamble, standing to hug Elena tightly. "And before you tell me you're fine, don't. I've known you too long for that nonsense." Elena managed a weak smile as she slid into the booth. "I survived it. That's something, right?" "Surviving isn't the same as being okay," Grace replied, flagging down their usual waitress. "Coffee and a blueberry muffin for Elena, and don't let her tell you she's not hungry." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Grace wisely giving Elena space to gather her thoughts. The cafe bustled around them with its usual Tuesday morning crowd, retired couples sharing newspapers, young mothers meeting after dropping kids at school, construction workers grabbing quick breakfasts between jobs, normal people living normal lives where family meant what it was supposed to mean. "I keep thinking I must have done something wrong," Elena finally said, stirring sugar into her coffee with unnecessary concentration. "Like maybe I was too involved, or not involved enough, or maybe I said something that offended Brittany without realizing it." Grace pulled out her phone, her expression shifting to something more determined. "Elena, honey, I need to show you something. I wasn't sure if I should, but after seeing you like this—" She hesitated, thumb hovering over her screen. "I found the wedding photos online." Elena's stomach lurched. "Grace, I don't think I can—" "Just look," Grace said firmly, turning her phone toward Elena. "Look at this picture specifically." The image filled the screen, a formal family portrait taken during the reception. Elena could see Marcus and Brittany in the center, radiant and perfect. Brittany's parents flanked one side, beaming with pride. But what made Elena's breath catch was the figure seated prominently in the front row, an elderly man in a wheelchair, clearly in his 80s, wearing a boutonniere and surrounded by family members who were obviously doting on him. "That's Brittany's grandfather," Grace said quietly. "Thomas Chen, 86 years old, according to the caption, flew in from Seattle despite having mobility issues." Elena stared at the photo, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "But they said—" "Marcus told me it was immediate family only, too small for—" Grace swiped to the next photo. "There are 43 people in the group shots, Elena. I counted. Brittany's college roommate was there, Marcus's old boss from his first job, 3 of Brittany's cousins from her mother's side." She paused, letting the information sink in. "Her grandfather's nurse even got invited because he couldn't travel alone." The cafe noise seemed to fade into background static as Elena absorbed the truth. This wasn't about space limitations, or COVID restrictions, or keeping things small. This was about her specifically being unwanted, while everyone else who mattered to them was celebrated and included. "They lied to me," Elena whispered, the words feeling strange and foreign in her mouth. "They looked me in the eye and lied." "They didn't just lie," Grace said, her voice gentle but firm. "They erased you, completely and deliberately." Elena scrolled through more photos, the ceremony, the reception, the dancing, the cake cutting. In 47 photos documenting the most important day of her son's life, she didn't exist. It was as if 32 years of raising him, loving him, sacrificing for him had been digitally removed from his history. But somehow, seeing the truth laid out so clearly was liberating. For months, she'd been questioning herself, wondering what she'd done wrong, how she could fix things. Now she knew. This wasn't about her behavior or her worthiness. This was about their choice to exclude her while including everyone else who meant something to them. The weight of confusion lifted, replaced by something Elena hadn't felt in months: clarity. The drive home from Rosie's cafe felt different than any car ride Elena had taken in months. Instead of the familiar weight of confusion and self-doubt pressing down on her shoulders, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before the wedding planning began: mental clarity. The truth, as painful as it was, had a cleansing quality that all her weeks of wondering and worrying had lacked. Elena parked in her usual spot and sat in her car for a few extra minutes, watching her neighbors go about their normal Tuesday routines. Mrs. Patterson was tending to her rose garden, Mr. Kim was washing his truck, and the Johnson twins were riding their bikes in careful circles on the sidewalk. Simple, honest activities by people who probably took for granted that their families actually wanted them around. For the first time in months, Elena wasn't rushing to check her phone for messages from Marcus or Brittany. She wasn't hoping for an invitation that probably wouldn't come or planning her next attempt to bridge whatever gap had formed between them. The photos Grace had shown her had burned away all the excuses and rationalizations she'd been making on their behalf. Inside her apartment, Elena moved with a purpose she hadn't felt since retirement. She walked directly to the wall of family photos that had dominated her living room for 3 years and began taking them down, one by one. Not in anger, but with the methodical precision of someone finally seeing clearly. The photo from Sophie's last birthday party was the first to go, the one where Elena stood awkwardly to the side while everyone else clustered around the birthday girl. She studied it for a moment, noticing details she'd missed before: how Brittany's arm was positioned to subtly block Elena from getting closer to Sophie, how Marcus was looking at his phone instead of including his mother in the conversation, how even 6-year-old Sophie seemed to have absorbed the family dynamic that positioned Elena as peripheral rather than central. Next came the Christmas photos from last year, where Elena had been relegated to the end of the couch while Brittany's parents occupied the prime spots near Sophie and the tree. Elena remembered how she'd convinced herself that was just how the seating had worked out naturally, but now she could see the careful orchestration behind every family gathering. She gathered all the photos into a neat stack and placed them in a box, not to throw away, but to stop torturing herself with daily reminders of how little she'd mattered in moments she'd thought were precious family memories. In their place, she pulled out older photos that had been relegated to drawers and albums, pictures of herself and Robert on their travels, images from her teaching career where she was surrounded by students and colleagues who genuinely valued her presence, photos with her brother David and his family in Arizona, where her laugh looked natural and unguarded. Elena made herself a proper lunch for the first time in weeks: a grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup, comfort food that tasted like comfort instead of ash. As she ate, she thought about the patterns Grace had helped her see. This exclusion hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual erasure that she'd participated in by constantly making excuses for their behavior and blaming herself for the growing distance. The realization that hurt most was how much energy she'd wasted trying to earn back a place in their lives that they'd never intended to give her. While she'd been diminishing herself to fit into their increasingly narrow definition of family, they'd been moving forward without her, creating new traditions and memories that had no space for the woman who'd raised the groom. But underneath the hurt was something unexpected: relief. Elena no longer had to wonder what she'd done wrong or how she could fix things. She no longer had to walk on eggshells or second-guess every interaction. The problem wasn't her behavior or her worthiness. The problem was their choice to treat her as expendable while treating everyone else as essential. For the first time in months, Elena felt like herself again. Not the diminished, apologetic version she'd become, but the strong woman who'd raised a child alone and built a successful career and deserved better than being tolerated by people who should have cherished her. Elena's transformation began on a Wednesday morning in June with something as simple as saying yes to an invitation she would have previously declined. Margaret Thompson, a fellow retired teacher from Jefferson Elementary, called to ask if Elena would be interested in joining the Riverside Community Center's book club, which met every Thursday evening. "I know you've been busy with family stuff," Margaret said, "but we're reading Educated by Tara Westover this month, and I immediately thought of you. You always had such insightful perspectives on complicated family dynamics." 6 months ago, Elena would have automatically said no, worried that Marcus or Brittany might need her on short notice. Instead, she heard herself saying, "I'd love to join. What time do you meet?" That Thursday evening, sitting in a circle of 8 women ranging from their 50s to their 70s, Elena rediscovered the pleasure of intellectual conversation with people who actually listened to her opinions. When she shared her thoughts on the book's themes of family loyalty versus self-preservation, the other women nodded thoughtfully and built on her ideas rather than dismissing them as outdated or irrelevant. "You have such a gift for articulating complex emotions," said Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired psychologist. "Have you ever considered writing about your own experiences?" Elena tucked that suggestion away like a seed that might grow into something meaningful later. The next week, Elena volunteered at the community center's summer reading program for children. Working with kids again felt like putting on a favorite sweater that had been forgotten in the back of a closet, comfortable, familiar, and exactly right. The children responded to her with the same enthusiasm she remembered from her teaching days, clustering around her during story time and begging her to read just one more chapter. "You're a natural with them," observed Janet, the program coordinator. "Would you be interested in helping with our weekend literacy tutoring program? We have several kids who could really use one-on-one attention." Elena signed up immediately, feeling useful in a way she hadn't experienced since Sophie had started spending less time with her. By July, Elena's calendar had filled with activities that had nothing to do with waiting for her family to need her. Tuesday mornings were coffee dates with Grace. Wednesday afternoons were volunteering at the community center. Thursday evenings were book club. Saturday mornings were spent tutoring 8-year-old Kevin, whose single mother worked double shifts and couldn't afford private reading help. Elena began documenting everything with the methodical attention to detail that had made her an excellent teacher. She kept copies of every text message, every phone call log, every declined invitation. Not out of spite, but with the growing awareness that she needed to protect herself legally and emotionally from people who had proven they couldn't be trusted to tell her the truth. When Marcus called in mid-July asking if she could babysit Sophie that weekend, because they had a last-minute opportunity to go wine tasting, Elena consulted her own calendar instead of automatically saying yes. "I'm sorry, but I have commitments this weekend," she said calmly. "Maybe you could ask Brittany's parents?" The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Clearly, Marcus had expected her to be sitting by her phone, available at a moment's notice like she'd always been before. "What kind of commitments?" he asked, and Elena could hear the confusion in his voice. "I'm tutoring Saturday morning, and I have book club plans Saturday evening," Elena replied without elaborating. She didn't owe him a detailed explanation of her life any more than he'd given her a detailed explanation of why she wasn't welcome at his wedding. Elena also began quietly researching grandparents' rights in her state, not because she intended to wage legal warfare, but because she wanted to understand her options. Knowledge, she'd learned from 30 years of teaching, was always power. Most importantly, Elena started planning her own future instead of waiting for permission to exist in someone else's. Her brother David's offer to move to Arizona and help with his landscaping business suddenly seemed less like running away and more like running towards something better. For the first time in years, Elena was building a life that belonged entirely to her. The first crack in Marcus and Brittany's carefully constructed world appeared on a sweltering Thursday evening in late July. Elena was at book club, discussing The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo with 8 other women who hung on her every insight about resilience and reinvention, when her phone buzzed with an incoming call from Marcus. She glanced at the screen and let it go to voicemail, something that would have been unthinkable just 2 months earlier. When the meeting ended an hour later, she had 3 missed calls and 2 increasingly frantic text messages. "Mom, can you call me back ASAP? Emergency with Sophie." "Mom, where are you? Sophie is sick and we need help." Elena waited until she was home with a cup of tea before returning the call, and when Marcus answered on the first ring, she could hear Sophie crying in the background, along with Brittany's stressed voice asking if he'd reached Elena yet. "Mom, thank God," Marcus said, relief flooding his voice. "Sophie has a fever of 101 and she's been throwing up." Brittany has that big brand partnership meeting tomorrow that she absolutely cannot miss. And I have the Morrison presentation at 9 a.m. Can you come stay with her?" Elena sipped her tea slowly, noting how quickly she'd gone from being unnecessary for major life events to being essential for inconvenient emergencies. "Have you tried calling Brittany's parents?" "They're in Europe for their anniversary, remember? Mom, Sophie is asking for you. She keeps saying she wants Grandma Elena to make her feel better." The familiar tug at Elena's heartstrings was still there, but it was tempered now by something stronger: self-respect. "I'm sorry, Marcus, but I have tutoring commitments in the morning that I can't cancel. Kevin's mother is counting on me, and his reading assessment is next week." The silence on the other end was profound. Elena could practically hear Marcus processing the reality that his mother had a life that didn't revolve around his family's emergencies. "Since when do you tutor?" he asked, as if Elena's post-retirement activities were somehow suspicious. "Since I stopped waiting around for my own family to need me," Elena replied evenly. "Maybe you could take the sick day? I seem to remember you calling in sick to take care of Sophie before." After they hung up, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the satisfaction of setting a boundary and watching it hold. Marcus called back 20 minutes later to report that he'd managed to reschedule his presentation and would be staying home with Sophie himself. The pattern continued throughout August. Brittany, who had grown accustomed to Elena being available for last-minute childcare whenever her content creation schedule demanded flexibility, began running into the reality that her free babysitter had developed her own priorities. When their regular nanny quit with 2 days' notice, Elena was busy with her volunteer commitments and unavailable to fill the gap. Elena also noticed changes in how they spoke to her during their increasingly infrequent conversations. The casual dismissiveness was being replaced by a cautious politeness, as if they were beginning to realize they might need to maintain a better relationship with her after all. "How's your book club going?" Brittany asked during one stilted phone conversation, clearly trying to show interest in Elena's new activities. "It sounds really intellectual." "It's wonderful," Elena replied. "We're reading Circe next month. I'm looking forward to discussing themes of family betrayal and finding your own power." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Meanwhile, Elena's new life was flourishing in ways that had nothing to do with her family's approval. Kevin's reading had improved dramatically under her tutoring, and his mother had recommended Elena to 3 other families. The book club members had started inviting Elena to other social events: gallery openings, theater performances, weekend hiking trips. She was rediscovering parts of herself that had been dormant during her years of devoted grandmother service. Most telling of all, Elena had stopped checking her phone obsessively and stopped analyzing every interaction with Marcus and Brittany for signs of thaw or rejection. Their opinion of her, while still painful, was no longer the determining factor in her sense of self-worth. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship for 3 years was shifting, and for the first time since the wedding photos, Elena felt like she was the one in control of her own life. The confrontation Elena had been unconsciously preparing for arrived on a humid Saturday morning in late August, announced by the aggressive sound of Marcus's car door slamming in her apartment complex parking lot. Elena was watering her small herb garden on the balcony when she spotted him striding across the courtyard with the determined gait of someone who'd worked up considerable frustration during the drive over. She'd been expecting this visit for weeks. Marcus had grown increasingly agitated by her unavailability, and their phone conversations had become exercises in barely contained irritation on his part and calm boundary setting on hers. The final straw had apparently been Elena's polite but firm refusal to cancel her weekend plans to watch Sophie, while Marcus and Brittany attended a couples retreat in Napa Valley. "We'll discuss this when I get there," Marcus had said during their last phone call, using the authoritative tone he'd perfected during his marketing career. "This whole situation has gotten ridiculous, Mom." Elena let him knock twice before opening the door. He stood there in expensive, casual clothes, designer jeans and a polo shirt that probably cost more than Elena spent on groceries in a month, with an expression that reminded her uncomfortably of his teenage years when he'd been caught breaking curfew. "Mom, we need to talk," he announced, brushing past her into the living room without waiting for an invitation. "Hello, Marcus," Elena said mildly, closing the door behind him. "Would you like some coffee?" "I don't want coffee. I want to know what's going on with you." He turned to face her, hands on his hips in a pose of parental authority that would have been amusing if it weren't so presumptuous. "You've been acting really strange lately, and frankly, it's affecting our whole family." Elena settled into her favorite armchair, the one that used to feel secondary in her own home when Marcus and Brittany visited, but now felt perfectly suited to her comfort. "Strange how?" "You know how. You're never available anymore. You have all these mysterious commitments. You barely spend time with Sophie. It's like you don't care about being part of this family." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for months. Elena studied her son's face, looking for traces of the boy who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms, who had cried when she dropped him off for his first day of college, who had once told her she was his hero. "Sit down, Marcus," Elena said quietly. Something in her tone must have penetrated his indignation because he perched on the edge of the couch, suddenly looking less certain of his position. Elena reached for the manila folder she'd been keeping on her coffee table for exactly this moment. "I want to show you something." She opened the folder and pulled out the printed wedding photos Grace had helped her collect from various social media accounts. She laid them out on the coffee table between them like evidence in a trial. The ceremony photos showing 43 guests, the reception images featuring Brittany's elderly grandfather in his wheelchair, the family portraits that included cousins, college friends, work colleagues, and even the grandfather's traveling nurse. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, a flush of embarrassment that confirmed Elena's suspicions about his complicity in the deception. "You told me it was immediate family only," Elena said, her voice steady and calm. "You looked me in the eye and told me there wasn't room for the woman who raised you, who worked double shifts to pay for your college, who gave you $25,000 for your house down payment." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but Elena held up her hand. "Brittany's grandfather flew in from Seattle. Her college roommate from 15 years ago was there. Your old boss from your first job got an invitation. But your mother, the person who sacrificed everything to give you the life that made this wedding possible, wasn't even worth a phone call to explain why." "Mom, it wasn't like that." "What was it like, Marcus?" Elena asked, and for the first time in months, she felt completely calm. "Explain to me how 43 people constitutes a small, intimate gathering that couldn't accommodate one more person. Explain to me how your wife's grandfather was essential, but your mother was expendable." The silence stretched between them, filled with 32 years of love, sacrifice, and expectations that had somehow led to this moment of complete honesty. Marcus stared at the wedding photos spread across Elena's coffee table, his face cycling through expressions like a broken slot machine: denial, guilt, anger, and finally, a desperate attempt at justification. Elena watched him with the detached curiosity of someone observing a fascinating but ultimately predictable experiment. "Mom, you're taking this all wrong," Marcus began, his voice taking on the smooth, persuasive tone he used in marketing presentations. "The guest list it was complicated. There were family politics involved that you don't understand. Brittany's family has these expectations, and her grandfather specifically requested—" "Stop," Elena said quietly, and something in her voice made Marcus's words die in his throat. "Just stop lying to me. We're past the point where your excuses mean anything." She reached for a second folder she'd kept beside her chair, one Marcus hadn't noticed in his initial survey of the room. This folder was thicker, more organized, and had a business card paper-clipped to the front. "I've been documenting everything, Marcus," Elena said, opening the folder to reveal printed text messages, email screenshots, and a detailed timeline she'd constructed over the past 2 months. "Every dismissive conversation, every canceled plan, every time you made me feel like I was asking for too much by wanting to be treated like family." Marcus's eyes widened as he recognized his own text messages printed in black and white, conversations that looked much harsher and more calculated when removed from the context of Elena's automatic forgiveness. "This is crazy, Mom. You're acting like we're in some kind of legal battle." "I consulted with a family attorney about grandparents' rights," Elena said matter-of-factly, noting how Marcus's face went pale. Marianne Walsh, very experienced with parental alienation cases. She found our situation quite interesting, especially the documented pattern of excluding me while including other grandparents in identical circumstances. The business card attached to the folder read Walsh and Associates Family Law in elegant serif font. Elena had indeed met with Marianne Walsh, not because she wanted to wage legal warfare, but because she'd needed to understand her options, and more importantly, to understand her own worth in legal terms. The consultation had been enlightening in ways that had nothing to do with custody law. "But here's what's really interesting, Marcus," Elena continued, closing the legal folder and reaching for a third item, a manila envelope that had been hidden beneath the others. "I also spent some time thinking about what I really want from this situation." She pulled out a single sheet of paper, a formal letter on business letterhead from Desert Bloom Landscaping and Design in Phoenix, Arizona. Marcus reached for it automatically, his marketing-trained eyes scanning the professional formatting. "Your Uncle David has offered me a position with his company," Elena explained as Marcus read. "Business manager and client relations coordinator. It's a growing company, and he needs someone with my organizational skills and people management experience. The salary is quite good, and Phoenix has an excellent community of active retirees." Marcus looked up from the letter with an expression of genuine shock. "You're moving to Arizona?" "I'm strongly considering it," Elena said. "David's been asking me to relocate for years, but I always said no because I didn't want to be far from you and Sophie. But that was when I thought I had a meaningful place in your lives." She gestured to the wedding photos, still scattered on the coffee table. "Clearly, my geographic proximity isn't as important to your family as I believed it was." Marcus's voice cracked slightly when he spoke. "Mom, you can't just move across the country because you're upset about the wedding. That's extreme." "What's extreme?" Elena replied evenly, "is spending 3 years of my life trying to earn back my place in a family that had already decided I didn't belong. What's extreme is working myself into emotional exhaustion to be available for people who consider me a convenience rather than a priority." She leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact with her son. "I'm 58 years old, Marcus. I have at least 20 good years ahead of me, maybe more. I can spend them continuing to beg for scraps of affection from people who've made it clear I'm expendable, or I can build a life with people who actually value my presence." The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the weight of 32 years of relationship, suddenly rebalancing on an entirely different foundation. The doorbell rang 3 days later at exactly 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, interrupting Elena's peaceful dinner of grilled salmon and steamed vegetables, a meal she'd prepared for one without the familiar pang of loneliness that used to accompany solo dining. She opened the door to find Marcus standing on her doorstep, but this time he wasn't alone. Sophie bounced on her toes beside him, wearing the pink dress with unicorns that Elena had bought her for Easter, back when gift-giving had still felt welcome rather than awkward. "Surprise, Grandma Elena!" Sophie announced with the theatrical enthusiasm of a 6-year-old who had clearly been coached on her role in this visit. "Daddy said we could come see you." Elena's heart contracted with the familiar mixture of love and pain that Sophie's presence always triggered. But this time, she was aware of the manipulation happening beneath the surface of this seemingly spontaneous visit. Marcus stood behind his daughter with an expression that tried to project casual confidence but couldn't quite hide his underlying desperation. "Hi, sweetheart," Elena said, kneeling to Sophie's level and accepting the enthusiastic hug that followed. "What brings you both by tonight?" "We brought Chinese food," Sophie announced, pointing to the bags Marcus carried from Golden Dragon, Elena's favorite restaurant. "Daddy said you might be hungry, Elena looked up at Marcus, who had the grace to appear slightly embarrassed by the transparency of his peace offering. "I thought maybe we could have dinner together," he said with forced casualness. "Like we used to." The phrase, "like we used to," hung in the air with all its loaded implications. Elena stood up slowly, studying her son's face, while Sophie chattered about her new art class and how she'd learned to draw horses that actually looked like horses instead of dogs with long necks. "That's very thoughtful," Elena said finally. "Please come in." She led them to her small dining room, noting how Sophie immediately gravitated toward the chair that used to be her spot during their weekly Sunday dinners. Marcus unpacked the food with the careful attention of someone trying to recreate a ritual that had already been broken beyond repair. "Sophie has something she wants to ask you," Marcus said as they began eating, his voice carrying the slightly rehearsed quality of a parent prompting a reluctant child through a difficult conversation. Sophie looked up from her lo mein with the solemn expression of someone delivering important news. "Daddy says you might move away to where Uncle David lives." "That's right," Elena confirmed gently. "I'm thinking about it." "But then who will make me pancakes on Saturday mornings?" Sophie asked, her lower lip beginning to tremble in a way that would have completely undone Elena just 2 months earlier. Elena felt the familiar pull of guilt and love, but underneath it was something stronger. The hard-won clarity that had taken months of disappointment to develop. She reached across the table to take Sophie's small hand in hers. "Sweetheart, I love making pancakes with you, but I haven't been able to do that in a long time because your mommy and daddy have been too busy for our Saturday mornings together." Sophie turned to look at her father with confusion. "But Daddy, you said Grandma Elena was always too busy to see me." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus's face went through several expressions before settling on embarrassed defeat. Elena watched him realize that his daughter had just exposed the lie he'd apparently been telling to explain Elena's absence from their lives. "That's not, I mean," Marcus struggled to find words that wouldn't further incriminate him in front of his daughter. Elena squeezed Sophie's hand gently. "Sometimes grown-ups get confused about who's busy and who's not," she said diplomatically. "But the important thing is that I love you very much, no matter where I live." "Could I visit you in Arizona?" Sophie asked, with the hopeful innocence of a child who hadn't yet learned that geography often becomes a convenient excuse for adult relationships that have already fractured. Elena looked at Marcus, whose expression now showed genuine panic at the prospect of losing his primary tool for emotional manipulation. For the first time in their conversation, Elena felt a flicker of sympathy for her son, recognizing that he was finally beginning to understand the consequences of his choices. "We'll see, sweetheart," Elena said softly. "We'll see." 3 weeks later, Elena stood in her nearly empty apartment, the morning sunlight streaming through bare windows that no longer displayed the family photos that had once defined her identity. The moving truck had left an hour ago, carrying her carefully packed life toward a future that belonged entirely to her for the first time in decades. The space felt simultaneously hollow and liberated, like a stage set after the final curtain call. Only a few essential items remained: her suitcase for tomorrow's flight to Phoenix, a small cooler with snacks for the journey, and the single framed photograph she'd chosen to keep on her mantelpiece until the very last moment. Not a family photo, but a picture of herself from her retirement party, surrounded by colleagues and students who had genuinely celebrated her contributions to their lives. Elena walked through each room one final time, remembering not just the recent painful months, but the earlier years when this apartment had been filled with laughter, Sunday dinners, and the easy warmth of family relationships that hadn't yet been poisoned by manipulation and conditional love. She allowed herself to feel the grief for what had been lost, but also the profound relief of no longer carrying the exhausting burden of trying to earn her place in hearts that had apparently closed to her long before she'd noticed. Her phone sat silent on the kitchen counter. No desperate last-minute calls from Marcus, no tearful pleas from Brittany, no guilt-inducing messages featuring Sophie asking when Grandma Elena was coming home. The silence itself was telling. Even faced with the reality of her permanent departure, they had maintained their position that her presence in their lives was optional rather than essential. The apartment phone rang, her landline, which almost no one used anymore. Elena almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up on the fourth ring. "Elena? It's Margaret from book club." The familiar voice brought an immediate smile to Elena's face. "I know you're leaving today, but I wanted to call one more time to tell you how much you've meant to our group. The way you talked about reinvention and finding your authentic self. Honey, you inspired all of us." "Thank you, Margaret. That means more than you know." "And Elena, I hope you know that what happened with your family, that wasn't about your worth as a person or as a grandmother. Sometimes people get so caught up in their own narratives that they can't see the treasures right in front of them." After hanging up, Elena felt a profound sense of completion. Over the past months, she had discovered that her capacity for love, wisdom, and contribution hadn't diminished just because her son and his family had failed to value it. The children she tutored adored her. Her book club friends sought her insights. David's business clients had already expressed enthusiasm about working with her when she arrived in Phoenix. Elena picked up her keys and took one last look around the apartment that had been both her sanctuary and her prison. On the kitchen table, she left a small gift wrapped in tissue paper, a children's book about a grandmother who goes on adventures around the world, with a note that read, "For Sophie, with love. Maybe someday you'll understand that the people who love you most are the ones who choose their own happiness alongside yours. Love always, Grandma Elena." She locked the door behind her and walked toward her car without looking back. The drive to the airport felt like the first day of a life she had chosen, rather than one that had been imposed upon her by other people's needs and expectations. As Elena's plane lifted off the runway, she pressed her face to the window and watched the city where she'd raised Marcus shrink below her. Somewhere down there, her son and his family were going about their Tuesday routines, probably convinced that her departure was a dramatic overreaction that would eventually be reversed when she came to her senses. But Elena knew better. Sometimes the most radical act of love is refusing to accept less than you deserve, even from people you would die for. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your family is showing them what self-respect looks like, even if they're not ready to understand the lesson. The flight attendant offered Elena a complimentary beverage, and she asked for champagne. As the bubbles tickled her nose, Elena smiled out the window at the vast sky ahead of her and felt, for the first time in years, genuinely excited about what tomorrow might bring. Try.